According to archival documents preserved in military collections, the train convoy in question was assembled in early April 1943 at one of the transit points near Smolensk. In the railway paperwork, it appeared as an ordinary transport of prisoners of war without any special markings. Only on the last page of the report, written in small script, there was a note stating that one of the wagons carried women suspected of belonging to partisan bands. This phrasing reflected the habitual language of the occupying forces, who did not acknowledge concepts such as lawful resistance or personal dignity. The women listed there varied in age and in their pre-war occupations. Among them were telephone operators, nurses, teachers, and collective farm workers. Some were prisoners of the Red Army. Others were civilians arrested in occupied villages under suspicion of helping partisans. What united them was a single fact: the Nazi system considered such individuals particularly dangerous. A woman who managed to enter military service or the underground was perceived as a disruption of the established order, provoking irritation and fear among the occupiers. According to accounts left by survivors, the conditions before their departure were typical for the spring of 1943. The temporary camp consisted of a fenced area with several barracks and crude field kitchens. Overcrowding, dampness, almost complete lack of food, and constant inspections formed the daily routine. Within this persistent brutality lay a larger pattern, a gradual numbing of the senses, when a person begins to believe that nothing could become worse. Yet in such moments, some prisoners experience the opposite effect. When familiar structures collapse and the future narrows to the prospect of an unknown camp deep inside Germany, the mind refuses to view the upcoming journey as a simple continuation of present conditions. So it was with the women who would soon be placed in that very wagon. They did not know each other earlier and came from different units and different villages. But in their biographies, there was already a moment when each of them had chosen not to submit. That choice would shape everything that followed. Among those destined for the transport was a group of women who had previously worked as signalers and telephone operators. They retained habits of close attention to detail and to technical surroundings. They noted the positions of guard towers, the number of patrols, the rhythm of sentry rotations, and the type of weapons the guards carried. In the camp, such observations seemed a useless echo of civilian life, but later they would allow the women to identify weak points in the convoy's security. By this time, German command already had extensive experience with transporting large groups of prisoners, but no additional resources were allocated for guarding a women's transport. Records show a standard arrangement: several closed freight wagons locked from the outside, guards stationed on end platforms, and a junior field police officer in charge. To the officers, it was a routine movement of prisoners. They did not expect physically exhausted and malnourished women to pose any real threat. The reality that awaited the convoy had formed months earlier. In the autumn of 1942, when partisan activity intensified across the occupied territories and communication lines were repeatedly sabotaged, the German supply system strained under shortages of fuel, vehicles, and manpower. Under such conditions, any delay in rail traffic was unacceptable, and any escape attempt was treated as a threat to overall stability. For that reason, local command acted harshly while preparing transports, ensuring visible discipline above all else. The women standing in formation for loading knew nothing of these logistical concerns. They did not see the staff reports or hear the officers' conversations. Their world consisted only of the mud beneath their feet, the cold wind, and the heavy steps of guards across the churned ground. They heard bolts snapping shut when the sentries grew nervous, and the metallic click of keys locking the camp gates. The very sound of metal striking metal became part of their daily existence. Later, that sound would be associated with one of the most unexpected decisions of their lives. In some of the women's earlier belongings, there were seemingly insignificant items that had survived with them. One used a pin to fasten her headscarf. Another kept several hairpins in her hair. In peacetime, such objects carried no meaning. In the camp, any small item that remained with a prisoner became a resource. German searches were thorough, but not flawless. Minor objects, especially those not resembling weapons or documents, often escaped notice. This was how a few metal hairpins went unrecorded during inspection. When the command finally ordered the women to assemble for departure, none of them knew where they were being sent. Rumors mentioned camps in Poland and Germany, factories and quarries, long roads from which no return was expected. In such circumstances, people perceive the future in two possible ways. Some resign themselves to fate, hoping for chance. Others search for any possibility, however faint, to influence what lies ahead. In the camp near Smolensk, a small number of women belonged to the latter group. In their minds, the first outlines of a thought began to form, not a plan, not a spoken idea, but an impulse. It appeared in the way they studied the locks on the gates, memorized distances between the towers, and listened to the night footsteps of guards. They did not know that soon they would be locked inside a freight wagon, where wooden walls and iron bars would become both an obstacle and an opportunity. Nor did they know that small pieces of metal hidden in their hair would eventually serve as tools whose significance even they themselves could not yet imagine. Thus began the story of a transport that, on paper, was indistinguishable from hundreds of others. The official documents contain no place for the inner state of those driven into the wagons. Yet that state, a mixture of exhaustion, fear, and a persistent refusal to surrender, would become the unseen foundation of the events that followed. The route was drawn on military maps, wagon numbers entered in registers, guards assigned to their posts. Everything seemed calculated and predictable. Everything, except the behavior of people long assumed to be broken. Archival documents found after the war in the records of several German railway commandant offices allow the reconstruction of the approximate route of the transport that departed on 12 April 1943. Its assigned task was to move a group of prisoners of war westward to a large transit camp located in what is now Poland. The route crossed territories damaged by combat, where rail traffic was regularly interrupted by sabotage or fuel shortages. These same documents indicate that the convoy was assembled in haste, a circumstance that often increased the likelihood of errors in security. Yet at the moment of departure, no one noticed any disorder. The guards took their positions, the wagons were inspected, and the doors were sealed. Inside one of the closed wagons, the women could understand what was happening only through sound. The jolts and creaking noises revealed that the wagons had not been repaired for a long time. The damp smell of wood mixed with coal dust. The interior remained dark, with only thin strips of light slipping through the cracks in the boards. Conditions like these were typical for transports in the spring of 1943. Formally, the guards were required to inspect the structural condition of the wagons, but in practice this was often neglected. Departure deadlines were considered more important than the technical reliability of door mechanisms. According to surviving accounts, once inside the wagon, the women instinctively arranged the cramped space so that they would not interfere with one another. Documentary literature often describes such behavior as a form of self-regulation that emerges under extreme stress. Deprived of familiar landmarks, people attempt to organize whatever environment remains under their control. So it was here. The women positioned themselves to leave a small area free near the door and along the walls. This arrangement was not an attempt at escape. It was simply a habit developed in camp life, where every inch of space carries value. As the train slowly moved off, the interior filled with the clatter of metal parts, the heavy banging of couplings, and muffled cries from the guards outside. At the same time, another detail became clear. The door bolt was an older model, a sliding mechanism with two guides fixed directly to the wooden walls. These locks were strong, but with long use they often loosened. Cracks around the bolts showed that the wagon had made many previous trips. The women noted this silently, without thinking of it as part of any future action. Conditions inside deteriorated quickly. By midday, the air grew heavy, humid, almost tangible. There was no ventilation. The noise of the wheels drowned out most external sounds, and only during brief stops could the women sense that the train was passing through another station or checkpoint. From the pattern of braking and stopping, they could guess that the convoy was under the supervision of field police rather than frontline units. Field police often managed transports with older equipment, especially on secondary routes. Despite the exhausting conditions, the women with prior camp experience continued doing what they had learned to do best: observe. Some could estimate the distance of a sentry on the platform by the vibration of the floorboards. Others listened for how frequently the locks were checked during short halts. Gradually, a rough but functional picture emerged of what was happening outside. Over time, several women began to form the idea that the weaknesses of the old wagon might represent an opportunity. But such an idea could not become a plan unless there was something inside that could act on the lock mechanism. Considering the strictness of German inspections, the possibility seemed unlikely. Yet some women indeed had metal hairpins and small clips hidden in their hair. These items were flexible, narrow, and insignificant enough to escape attention. According to later testimonies, the first serious evaluation of the possibility of escape occurred only a few hours after departure. By then, the wagon's movement had become pronounced, and the women noticed that the lock produced a faint rattle, as if its parts were no longer perfectly aligned. A trained technician would have recognized it immediately as a sign of wear. Under peacetime conditions, the lock would have been replaced. In wartime, it was simply used again, with the hope that it would withstand yet another journey. By evening, it was clear that the train was moving slowly and stopping often. Such delays were common in areas where partisan groups operated. German command frequently increased security in these regions, but at the same time reduced speed out of fear of mines or ambushes. Paradoxically, the more security measures they applied, the slower the trains moved, increasing the frequency of stops, which in turn created windows of vulnerability, where an escape, while still improbable, was no longer impossible. During one such halt, the women heard the guards talking near the platform. They could not understand the words, but the tone conveyed fatigue and irritation. This suggested that the guards did not expect such a difficult journey and felt the same pressures as the prisoners, though to a far lesser degree. Under such circumstances, discipline often weakened unless an officer enforced it strictly. As night fell, the wagon grew quieter. The women conserved their strength and remained still. In the silence, the sounds of the lock and the sentry's footsteps became clearer. These sounds allowed them to estimate the frequency of patrols, no more than 2 or 3 rounds per hour. This was an important detail. A dense inspection schedule would have made any internal action nearly impossible. They also noticed that the lock on the door had a 2-stage structure, an outer sealing element and a heavy inner bolt. The outer seal was mostly symbolic. The bolt held the door shut. If it were possible to act on that bolt from inside even slightly, the vibration of the moving train could potentially help loosen it further. Individually, these observations did not guarantee anything, but together they revealed a pattern. The women retained their analytical ability even under extreme exhaustion. Official documents listed them only as numbers, but the reality was different. These were individuals still capable of assessing their surroundings. Thus ended the first day of the journey that would later become the starting point for events long considered impossible. The night of 12 to 13, April 1943, became a decisive stage in the later sequence of events. Although the women themselves did not yet understand this, darkness inside the wagon was almost absolute. Only thin shafts of moonlight penetrated through narrow cracks in the wooden boards, barely enough to distinguish the outlines of nearby figures. Yet night has one advantage: sounds become clearer. And it was through sound that the women continued to construct what could be called a map of their surroundings. They could clearly tell that the train was constantly changing speed. At times it moved in uneven jerks, as though the engineer doubted the condition of the tracks ahead. On such segments, the vibration increased and the bolt on the door shook more actively. The rattling of metal in those moments was especially noticeable. Anyone familiar with machinery would have recognized it as the sound of a worn-out mechanism. For the women, it was one of the few signs that their confined space was not an unchangeable structure, but a system under strain. Post-war technical analyses from railway workshops indicate that locks of this old type, installed years before the war, gradually lost rigidity due to constant vibration and lack of maintenance. The bolts loosened, the metal guides warped, and the wooden doors sagged. In wartime, with the acute shortage of functioning rolling stock, such defects were not considered critical. It was simply assumed that the wagon would endure one more trip. Inside the wagon, the women gradually began to sense the vulnerability of the lock through numerous small observations. By morning, they had determined that with each rough jolt of the train, the bolt shifted by fractions of a millimeter. They could not see it, but they could hear it. Such tiny details acquired enormous significance under these conditions. They suggested that the lock might give way over time, but that thought could become meaningful only if there existed an object capable of affecting the mechanism, an unlikely idea in the strict environment of German inspections. Yet in the semi-darkness, one woman reached into her hair and felt a small metal hairpin. It had survived only because the guards did not search hair thoroughly. The pin was thin, flexible, made from darkened metal. In ordinary life, it was nothing more than a grooming accessory. But in the reality of a sealed wagon, where every sound and every centimeter of wood mattered, even such a trivial item became disproportionately significant. It was around this time that the convoy stopped at a major intermediate station. Judging by the duration of the halt and the sounds outside, the train was being held until the tracks ahead were cleared. Such stops could last from 10 minutes to an hour. The women could hear that the guards were less tense, their steps were slower, and the tone of their voices betrayed fatigue. Long halts often weakened the vigilance of a convoy. This was an important factor, though not yet directly actionable. At several stations in this region, small partisan reconnaissance groups operated, tracking the movement of German trains. They rarely intervened directly due to the dangers involved, but their presence forced the Germans to operate under tension. This tension affected the guards, who were already worn down by long travel and poor conditions. During prolonged halts, they sometimes lingered away from their assigned posts. For the prisoners inside, these shifts in the rhythm of the convoy became subtle indicators of vulnerability. Inside the wagon, the temperature began to fall. The night was cold, and their breath turned into faint white vapor. Cold has a psychological impact. It drains energy and reduces clarity of thought. But at times, such conditions sharpen the instinct for survival. And in that sharpened state, the idea of acting on the lock from within began to take clearer shape. By morning, the women had no doubt that the train had covered a significant distance, but dozens or even hundreds of kilometers still lay ahead. They also understood that once they crossed the western border, the chance of escape would diminish to almost nothing. Research into human behavior under extreme conditions shows that awareness of a narrowing future often pushes individuals toward risk, when inaction appears more dangerous than action. German operational reports from that period mentioned delays caused by track sabotage. Such incidents caused unpredictable changes in rail schedules. This meant that in the coming days, the convoy would be forced to stop in open areas many times, far from major stations. During these halts, the number of guards was often minimal. For the women inside, These moments could become the only viable windows of opportunity. During another stoppage, the women heard the guards discussing a problem with one of the rear wagons. The nature of the sound suggested that a technical malfunction required inspection. Such situations inevitably disrupted the security structure. Guards shifted toward the problematic wagon. This weakened attention to the others. A small detail, but in a sealed wagon, every disruption mattered. It was during this time that the woman with the hairpin tested the lower part of the door near the lock. She gently slid the pin along the gap between the boards and felt that it passed several millimeters inside. This was not enough to manipulate the mechanism, but it proved that the door's structure had slight warping. Over time, such warping might increase, especially if acted upon subtly and consistently. That early test lasted only a few seconds and went unnoticed by most inside. Yet it marked the beginning of a sequence of actions that would use every weakness of the old construction. Many escape stories cite chance as the decisive factor. Here, the decisive factor was not chance, but awareness, the ability to recognize a potential tool in a simple hairpin, and to understand that a lock weakened by time might be persuaded to fail. Thus ended the morning of the second day, a morning that would later be remembered as the quiet beginning of a process no one outside the wagon imagined possible. By midday on 13 April 1943, the convoy was moving through one of the most overloaded railway sections, where traffic schedules shifted constantly due to sabotage and the shortage of locomotives. Outwardly, the journey appeared routine, yet the surrounding conditions gradually formed an atmosphere of uncertainty. The women inside the wagon did not know the exact route, but from the pattern of stops and changes in vibration, they could guess that the train was approaching an area where partisan activity was common. This meant danger for the convoy, and at the same time, a possibility. The more external factors distracted the guards, the weaker the security became. Inside the wagon, the women instinctively watched each other's reactions. Even without speaking, it was clear who still retained the ability to analyze the situation and who focused solely on enduring the next hour. Documentary studies of human behavior in extreme conditions describe such division as natural. Only a small number can direct their final reserves of strength towards action. And yet it is often these few who determine the fate of the entire group. Meanwhile, the woman with the hairpin continued to test the narrow opening near the bolt. She worked quietly, almost imperceptibly, ensuring that even the others inside the wagon would not be disturbed by her movements. Any unnecessary noise risked attracting attention. The hairpin bent slightly as she applied pressure, scraping against the inner surface of the metal guide. She quickly realized that the bolt could not be manipulated directly, but perhaps its mounting could be weakened over time. It would require patience, and there was very little time available. According to preserved German reports, trains in this region frequently halted on open stretches of track. Such halts did not involve dense guard coverage. Sentries remained on the platforms, but their vigilance was reduced, especially if the route was considered relatively safe. For the women, every such pause became a moment of lowered risk. These moments allowed cautious work on the lock, shielded by the noise of the environment and the distraction of the guards. During one of these stops, the hairpin caught the inner edge of the metal guide in a way that revealed its looseness more clearly than before. The metal had a faint spring to it, suggesting that the guide was already weakening. Some of the oldest freight wagons used in 1943 were recorded in German maintenance documents as overdue for repair. The women had been placed in one of these, a detail none of them could have predicted, but one that would prove crucial. At the same time, exhaustion inside the wagon reached a new level. The cold, the lack of air, and the growing hopelessness drained physical strength. Under these conditions, even the smallest action required concentration. The woman working with the hairpin acted slowly and deliberately. She moved her hand in a natural gesture, as if adjusting her hair, a gesture still preserved out of habit from the lives they had lived before captivity. When the train began to move again, the vibration intensified due to irregularities in the tracks. On some sections, the wheels struck against worn sleepers, causing the wagon to jolt sharply. In these moments, the bolt shifted more noticeably. The woman used each jolt, applying the slightest pressure on the hairpin so that the vibration would work against the weakened guide. The goal was not to force the lock open an impossible task in the short time available, but to hasten a deformation already underway. Another factor contributing to the situation was the exhaustion of the guards. From the footsteps and intervals between patrols, it became clear that the sentries were approaching the limits of their endurance. Earlier, they patrolled every 20 minutes. Now, their checks sometimes stretched to 40 or 50. This decline in discipline matched the observations found in German administrative records by this stage of the war. Discipline in escort units began to suffer, especially on secondary routes. The women understood that time was running out. Once the convoy reached a major rail junction, security would tighten, and the wagons would likely undergo inspection. Any visible damage to the door could lead to severe consequences. Thus, the only option was to exploit the weakening structure while the guards remained inattentive. As the evening approached and the convoy halted once more, longer this time, the woman with the hairpin felt something new. One of the bolts securing the metal guide shifted by an amount perceptible to the touch, perhaps a millimeter. Insignificant in ordinary circumstances, in a worn wooden structure, even such a shift meant that the process of loosening had entered an irreversible stage. The bolt no longer sat firmly in place. This was not enough to open the door. But it was enough to confirm that the old, neglected construction was beginning to fail, and that the hairpin, in concert with vibration, fatigue, and structural decay, could exploit that failure. Thus ended another short segment of the journey, outwardly no different from the countless others of that war. Yet within this brief interval, the first real signs appeared that the weakness of the old mechanism might serve as the foundation for a future escape. An escape that no one, least of all the guards, imagined possible. By the evening of 13 April 1943, the convoy entered a section of the railway known for irregular traffic, where delays were constant due to damaged tracks and a shortage of repair crews. These stretches were the most unpredictable. Sometimes trains waited for hours before being allowed to proceed. For the guards, such halts were an inconvenience that weakened discipline. This was evident from the sounds reaching the women inside. Footsteps lost their rhythm, fragments of conversations drifted by, and the sharp clang of rifle butts against the platform rails became infrequent. The women understood that these pauses were rare combinations of vulnerability and uncertainty moments that could work in their favor. Yet any action remained extremely dangerous. Although the bolt had begun to respond to vibration, it was still strong. A wrong movement could leave a scratch or mark that the guards might notice. But by now, the woman with the hairpin understood precisely when the vibration of the wagon reached its peak, helping the metal inside the guide shift under its own weight. During one extended halt, an unfamiliar stillness settled around the wagon. There were no station announcements, no noises from repair workers, and no other trains passing nearby. The silence indicated that they were far from major rail junctions, where infrastructure produced constant sound. Such isolation suggested that the guards perceived the area as safe. These were the so-called dead zones, regarded as low risk. And precisely because of this belief, they often allowed their attention to wane, a detail essential for the invisible work being done inside. Survivor accounts recorded years later note that during this halt, the woman with the hairpin managed to catch the inner edge of the bolt in a way that for the first time revealed a definite weakness. The metal guide, worn from age, moved slightly in response. This was consistent with German maintenance records describing wagons of this series as structurally fatigued, many overdue for extensive repairs. By happenstance or neglect, the women had been placed in one of the most worn wagons of the entire train, a detail that would shape the unfolding events. Inside, however, the women were reaching the limits of physical endurance. The cold, the lack of ventilation, and the growing sense of despair drained them rapidly. Under such conditions, even the smallest task required both strength and concentration. Yet the woman with the hairpin continued her delicate work, always disguising the motion as if brushing her hair, a habitual gesture retained from life before captivity. When the train resumed movement, the track irregularities became more severe. Damaged sleepers caused the entire wagon to jolt violently, amplifying vibrations. Each new jolt shook the bolt at its weakened point. The woman learned to use these moments, applying the slightest inward pressure with the hairpin so the vibration itself would intensify the deformation. She was not trying to open the lock directly. That would have been impossible. Instead, she encouraged the gradual weakening of the connection between the bolt and its guide. Meanwhile, the guard's fatigue was becoming impossible to ignore. Patrols grew increasingly irregular. What had been a strict 20-minute rotation at the start of the journey now stretched to intervals of 40 or even 50 minutes. German records from this phase of the war confirm such declines in escort discipline, especially on long secondary routes where officers lacked the resources to enforce strict control. The women understood that the clock was against them. Ahead lay a major railway junction where the convoy would be closely inspected, and any sign of tampering could bring severe punishment. Their delicate work had to be completed before that point, before the opportunity vanished. Later that evening, the train stopped again, this time longer than before. In the stillness that followed, the woman with the hairpin felt a sudden shift. One of the bolts securing the metal guide moved in a way that was unmistakable, slight but perceptible, perhaps a millimeter. Though tiny, in the context of a worn door and an aging mechanism, such a shift meant the structural failure had entered its irreversible stage. The guide no longer held the bolt firmly. This was far from enough to open the door, but it confirmed something critical. The old construction, weakened by time and vibration, was beginning to fail, and the subtle work of the hairpin was accelerating the process. Thus, by the end of the second day of travel, conditions inside the wagon transformed from mere confinement into the early stirrings of a real, tangible possibility of escape, the very possibility that would later be regarded as impossible. The night of 13 to 14 April 1943 marked the moment when the deformations in the lock began to manifest, not only as faint sounds, but as tangible shifts in the metal itself. The train continued forward in irregular intervals, sometimes accelerating, sometimes nearly stalling on inclines. On these unstable stretches, the wagon shook violently, and each wave of vibration traveled through the door mechanism, amplifying the weakening already underway. The women could hear the bolt producing duller, heavier taps, as though it no longer fit tightly within its frame. Post-war technical assessments describe similar deterioration in freight wagons that had gone without maintenance for more than 7 years. Wartime use accelerated the process. The rails were damaged, wagon suspensions were overburdened, and constant vibration wore down every structural element. What once seemed a solid barrier gradually transformed into a system of compromised connections. It was this gradual degradation that the woman with the hairpin relied on as she continued working cautiously, silently. During one of the train's sharp jolts, the hairpin slipped deeper into the gap than ever before, touching the inner edge of the bolt. The metal felt uneven, pitted with tiny indentations, marks of years of heavy use. The woman sensed that if vibration continued at this intensity, the bolt might shift further if gently guided. The goal was not to force the mechanism, but to assist a process already in motion. Each movement of the hairpin directed the mechanical stress to the same point, encouraging the guide to loosen. Outside, the guards drifted through their rounds with diminishing discipline. Through the wooden wall, the women could make out snippets of conversation and the uneven pacing of heavy boots. The convoy had been slowed repeatedly by damaged tracks, and the guards displayed the exhaustion typical of long journeys. German records from this period confirm such fatigue. Escort units were stretched thin, undermanned, and increasingly unable to maintain strict vigilance. These lapses were crucial. During extended pauses when no footsteps approached the wagon, the interior grew silent enough for the women to hear the bolt moving on its own small, involuntary motions created by the wagon's rocking. Though subtle, the nature of the sound had changed. The bolt no longer rattled uniformly. Instead, it shifted unevenly, signaling that one of the metal guides was weakening. Still, the situation remained precarious. Even if the bolt were to loosen further, the door was heavy, and opening it without a loud noise seemed nearly impossible. Furthermore, the external seal remained in place. Breaking it was out of the question. But if the bolt could be moved even slightly, a narrow gap might appear, offering access to a different angle of force, one that might expand the opening further. By early morning, the vibration grew more intense. The wagon lurched repeatedly as it crossed sections of track laid hurriedly on unstable ground. Inside, these jolts felt like sudden drops, accompanied by harsh creaks in the walls. Such conditions, though dangerous, were ideal for mechanical failure. Every new impact widened the gap between the bolt and its failing guide. The woman with the hairpin continued working only when noise from the track was loud enough to conceal her movements. Each slight shift of the pin coordinated with the natural motion of the wagon. She no longer aimed to push the bolt. Instead, she encouraged the deformations already occurring. By dawn, several things had become evident. The bolt no longer rested firmly in its guide. The vibrations of the track had intensified the deformation, widening the gap. And importantly, the door mechanism was now failing at a rate faster than the guards could realistically detect. The journey, however, was far from over. Ahead lay more checkpoints, more stations where inspections were possible. But now the possibility of manipulating the door was real, not theoretical, but physically achievable, dependent only on the right moment of vibration and the few millimeters separating confinement from escape. The morning of 14 April 1943 began with another halt on an open stretch of track, longer than any of the previous stops. From the sounds, or rather from the absence of them, it was clear that the locomotive stood motionless and that the guards were in no hurry to inspect the wagons. In this unusual quiet, the women could clearly hear the internal sounds of the door structure, the faint creaking of wood, the muted taps of metal, and slight vibrations detectable even through the thick boards. The bolt now produced a different tone, the uneven tremor of a part no longer held firmly in place. Technical descriptions found in archival sources confirm that when a bolt guide loses even a millimeter of stability, the vibrations of a moving train can accelerate its deformation without additional external force. Under normal circumstances, such a defect would demand immediate repair. Under wartime conditions, it was regarded merely as another imperfection among many. For the women, this defect was the fragile foundation of a potential escape. The woman with the hairpin continued her careful work, but now she achieved more than before. During one sudden vibration, the hairpin slipped into the gap deep enough for her to feel the bolt tilt faintly under her fingers. This proved that the gap between metal and wood had widened. She did not try to force the mechanism. Instead, she focused on intensifying the ongoing process. Each subtle movement of the pin directed the mechanical stress to the weakened point, letting the vibrations worsen the damage. Outside, the guards were preoccupied with their own concerns. Through the muffled wooden walls, the women heard fragments of speech, suggesting that a track failure had occurred on a neighboring section. That meant delays, manual inspections, and the redistribution of guard duties. When such disruptions happened, the structured rhythm of surveillance weakened noticeably. The guards walked less frequently, lingered longer in place, and moved with less coordination, a change that became increasingly apparent. Inside, several women sensed the alterations in the wagon, even without understanding their cause. With each jolt, the door trembled more sharply. Those sitting nearest to the wall felt faint shifts in the structure, tiny motions transmitted through the boards. Though subtle, they were unmistakable signs that the wagon was losing its rigidity. By midday, the bolt emitted a distinct metallic ping whenever the wagon lurched, a sound produced only when a metal element moves within its frame instead of remaining fixed. For the woman with the hairpin, this was the clearest confirmation so far. The bolt was no longer entirely secured, yet even this development did not guarantee a breakthrough. In older wagons, weakened bolts could still cling to position through the remaining strength of the surrounding wood. The train eventually resumed movement, passing through a section laid on temporary repairs wooden blocks instead of proper sleepers. These improvised supports caused unstable oscillations. The wheels struck each uneven joint with heavy force, producing violent jolts. For the mechanism weakened by hours of strain, these impacts were decisive. Each new vibration caused further separation between the bolt and its guide. The women knew that time was quickly running out. A major railway junction lay ahead, a site where security tightened. Patrols were more frequent, and wagons sometimes underwent inspection. If the slightest damage was discovered near the lock, the consequences would be severe. Anything that could be done had to be done before the train reached that checkpoint. As evening approached and the train stopped once again, this time with an extended pause, the hairpin caught the inner edge of the bolt in a way that allowed the woman to feel its movement clearly for the first time. The bolt shifted slightly when she pressed. It was not a large displacement, but a perceptible deviation from its axis. From a technical standpoint, such a shift marked the onset of the critical phase of structural fatigue, the moment when a metal element no longer returns to its original position and continues moving under vibration. In a typical freight wagon, this would signal urgent need for repair. For the women, it signaled something entirely different, the first tangible sign that the lock could, under the right circumstances, fail. Thus, the day ended with the realization that the old door mechanism was no longer performing its function fully. The door remained closed, but the internal structure had begun to surrender. The women now needed only one more opportunity, a strong enough vibration to push the failing mechanism to its limit. In the evening of 14 April 1943, the convoy entered one of the most deteriorated stretches of the railway. Here, the rails lay unevenly on weakened sleepers, and the vibration was harsher than on any previous segment of the journey. For a regular transport, this meant discomfort. For the women inside the wagon, it meant the approach of a decisive moment. The door mechanism continued to fail under the pressure of the shaking, and each new jolt deepened the deformations. The bolt, still held by the remaining fragments of wood and the second metal guide, now moved more freely than ever. From the sounds, it was clear that the train was gaining speed. This acceleration became a critical factor. The faster the train moved, the stronger the oscillation grew. What had once resisted pressure now responded to each vibration. The woman with the hairpin recognized this instantly. She no longer attempted any precise manipulation. Instead, she held the hairpin in the weakened gap, letting the vibration of the wagon deliver the necessary force. The metal inside responded with short, muted clicks, signs that the guide was continuing to detach from the wooden frame. Outside, the guards issued occasional commands, but their voices were distant and unsteady. Some indications suggested that the convoy was under pressure to make up lost time, possibly due to congestion at a rail junction ahead. When such circumstances arose, Guards concentrated less on the wagons and more on maintaining their own balance on the trembling platforms. Their attention drifted from the freight cars, a lapse that became essential to the chain of events. As the wagon swayed more violently on the unsteady track, the inevitable occurred. A particularly sharp jolt struck when the wheels hit a sunken joint. The impact caused the damaged wood around the bolt to crack. The bolt shifted forward far more than before. The women felt a faint, sudden draft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably a sign that the door had moved. A gap had opened, small but real. This change did not break the external seal. The metal loop stretched, but did not snap. The slight shift in the wooden panel allowed the door to tilt outward by several millimeters, enough to alter the balance of the mechanism. From this point onward, every vibration acted against the weakened structure. Minutes later, the train reached another severely uneven segment. The wagon lurched sharply to one side, then the other. During one of these movements, the door recoiled again. The gap widened. Those closest to the wall felt the movement clearly now. No longer the rigid tremble of a fixed panel, but the unstable motion of a structure losing its last hold. Another violent jolt followed. This time the bolt, no longer anchored firmly in the loosened guide, slipped partially out of place. The door swung open a few more centimeters, not fully, but enough to create an escape-sized opening. The external seal remained attached at the outer frame, but the inner mechanism had ceased to function. The women understood immediately. There would be no second chance. The noise of the train masked all sounds inside. The guards were too far to notice. The speed, though dangerous, created the only workable cover. Several women moved toward the opening, timing their actions with the rhythm of the rocking wagon. Outside lay a steep embankment, softened by spring earth rather than frozen ground. Jumping from a moving train was perilous, but every alternative led to certain consequences. One by one, taking advantage of the moment when the wagon swung closest to the slope, they slipped through the gap and leapt into the darkness. The train continued forward, unaware. The guards discovered the missing prisoners only much later, when the convoy approached a scheduled checkpoint. But by then, the women were gone, having vanished into the long stretches of land between Smolensk and the Western Territories during the spring of 1943. Thus ended the escape long considered impossible, an escape accomplished not through force, weapons, or a planned operation, but through the weakness of an old mechanism, the relentless vibration of worn rails, and the presence of a single hairpin. In wartime records, this episode became a footnote, yet it stood as a reminder that even in circumstances designed to eliminate every option, there remains space for human will to act, and sometimes to succeed.